Personally, I would love for the Orioles to trade for an ace this offseason, but to do that, they're going to have to part with one, if not more, of their top prospects. Could one of those guys be Samuel Basallo, especially with Adley Rutschman already at the major league level? We'll answer that question and more coming up on another mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, November 13th, 2023, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are opening up the mailbag once again. Another Mailbag Monday pod, 6 questions, all from you, the listeners, to answer about the Orioles today, including thoughts on the O's maybe going after Marcus Stroman, Samuel Basallo as a trade piece to go get a pitcher, the future for Trey Mancini, and the Orioles' ability to repeat what they did this year in 2024. Plus much more is all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That's Jase Medical.com. So let's open up the mailbag today here on a Monday. I got 6 questions, all from you, the listeners. Thank you so much for sending in your questions. I got a whole lot of mailbag questions over the weekend. Again, only getting to 6 on this episode, but there will be plenty of future mailbags this offseason. If you don't hear your question answered, most likely it's going to be answered on a future mailbag. If you want to send in questions, email us, lockedonorioles@gmail.com, tweet us at lockedonorioles, or leave your questions right here in the YouTube comments, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. We'll have at least another mailbag next week, maybe 2 in the next couple of weeks, so we'll get to your questions then. But 6 questions on today's episode, starting with our first question that came from Jeffrey on Twitter, who asks, thoughts on the Orioles targeting Marcus Stroman. Now, Marcus Stroman was a guy who I did not put in my top 10 for my Orioles starting pitching free agent wish list episode that I did last week. If you haven't checked that one out, go back and take a look. Now, Stroman was somewhat of a surprise free agent. There was an option there that many thought he might have picked up. He did not, instead getting to free agency. And the reason why many thought he would pick up that option is that Marcus Stroman had a very weird, really last 2 years in terms of his injuries while pitching for the Chicago Cubs. In 2022, he was around 130 innings that year because he had right shoulder inflammation. And for a lot of teams, shoulder injury puts up more red flags than even an elbow injury does for a pitcher. And he did come back later in the year, but it took a chunk out of his season. And this season, he once again only threw 136 and 2/3 innings for the Cubs. Now, when he was out there, he was solid, right? A 3.95 ERA, 57% ground ball rate, still an elite ground ball pitcher as a starter, but only a 21% strikeout rate, a little down for Stroman, 9% walk rate, a little bit up. Like, he wasn't at his best in 2023. And he also had a couple of injuries. One was just a blister early in the year, missed a couple of weeks. A lot of pitchers get them and usually recover. But later in the season, ended up with kind of an odd injury. He went down with a rib cartilage fracture. It was like initially called a hip injury when he first went on the injured list, but then it was this rib injury that is apparently pretty rare, and he missed months of the year. There was a time where the Cubs thought, oh, he'll only be out for about a month, he'll come back, and it just kept getting extended and extended. It was, one of the reasons why they didn't trade him at the deadline, because he ended up getting injured, although the Cubs, despite not making the playoffs, did hold on to their pieces at the trade deadline and actually add a little bit. But he eventually came back like right at the end of the year, and they planned to just use him out of the bullpen because they needed him. They were trying to get to the postseason, but he wasn't fully built up to be a starter. So he returned late in September, but there were still questions about like what his health is after all of those injuries. And because the numbers were also down in 23, I assumed he would just kind of try and get that money in 2024 in Chicago. But the projections for Stroman, this is coming from John Becker's free agency matrix, which averages every single projection that's out there for free agents, gives him a projection of a 3-year, $65 million contract in free agency this year for a right-hander that's going to be 32 next season. It's not too bad for a starting pitcher, but with all the injuries the last couple of years, and listen, Marcus Stroman, he's a polarizing guy for a multitude of reasons on the mound, and there's been some social media posts from Marcus Stroman that have been quite questionable over the last few years, but especially because of the injury history the last 2 years, and it's nice that he's a ground ball pitcher and not like a mainly strikeout pitcher. Sometimes if he loses a little velocity because of injuries, he can still be effective that way. But because of those injuries, I'm staying away from Marcus Stroman this offseason, especially if he's going to command more than $20 million per year, knowing how tight, unfortunately, John Angelos has set the Orioles' budget. Second question comes from Evan on Twitter, who asks, will we see Samuel Basallo traded to help the Orioles at the big league level because of Adley Rutschman being on the Orioles, or does he have a spot moving forward with the big league club? Now, if you're not familiar with Samuel Basallo, he is, at this point, I would say a slam dunk top 5 prospect in the Orioles system, and pretty much is at the point where he is a top 100 prospect in baseball. If he isn't already, by the time we get preseason lists, Samuel Basallo will be a top 100 guy. He is a special talent. 19-year-old left-handed hitting catcher who really to this point, and it's still early because remember, the Orioles weren't signing players at all internationally while Dan Duquette was GM. Mike Elias comes in November 2018. Because a lot of these deals are pretty sleazy and they're done under the table, a lot of them are done 2-3 years in advance. So really the Orioles couldn't truly start signing international free agents till basically 2021. Samuel Basallo was in that 2021 class, and so far, he has been the guy who is holding up the O's international signings so far. He's been great, top 100 guy, top 5 Orioles prospect, big 19-year-old left-handed hitting catcher, huge power, who ended up playing at 3 levels last year for the Orioles. Started in low A Delmarva, was just ridiculous, hit .299, .503 slugging, and about 350 plate appearances, 149 WRC plus. Right idea, 18-year-old, let's send him to high A. A lot of guys will actually take a step back when they get to Aberdeen because Aberdeen is very much a pitcher's park, and it does kind of bring down offensive numbers. Basallo's numbers went up in 115 plate appearances in high A Aberdeen. He hit .333 with a .608 slugging percentage. He had a .195 WRC plus in Aberdeen. He was so good that the Orioles decided, you know what? I know you're 18 years old, but let's give you a week at Double-A Bowie to end the season just to see how it goes for you. It went well. And the O's have done this with a lot of guys in the past, giving them like that 1 week at the end of the year at either Double-A or Triple-A just to get their feet wet, even if they're too young for the level, to get them ready for next year. And Basallo, he only played in 4 games in Double-A Bowie right at the end of the year. He casually went 7 for 15 with a double, a triple, only 1 strikeout in those 4 games. He looked like he would have been ready to play a month or more in Double-A. So Basallo, if he's still with the O's, is going to start the year as the number 1 catcher in Double-A Bowie, and he'll play some first base and he'll DH some like he's done at every level so far, but he's going to be in Double-A as a 19-year-old to start the season next year. He has a very exciting future. Now, there are still questions about Basallo if he sticks at the catcher position. Like, is he good enough defensively to be a number 1, 5 days a week catcher for a big league team? That is still the biggest question out on him, and of course, he's 19. You still have plenty of questions as he's still growing into his body at this point. But because he's played some first base and because the bat is so good, there's a spot for him on a team. And I understand wanting to trade him for a good pitcher. And if the Orioles can get a trade for an ace, for a Corbin Burns, for a Dylan Cease type, over the line because they include Samuel Basallo, 100% go for it. Because as good as he is with the bat, if his position is still catcher, you do have maybe the best catcher in baseball in Adley Rutschman locked up for 5+ more seasons at the big league level. So that's a good thing for the Orioles, that they have that at the catching position. And if he's the guy that can get you over the hump for an ace trade, 100%, no question about it, send him. But if Basallo doesn't fit in any of those ace trades, any of those trades to get you good pitching at the big league level, there is space for him once he would be ready at the big leagues. Now, he could surprise us and be big league ready late in 2024, but I suspect with the age starting the year at Double-A, he's more of a 2025 big leaguer for the Orioles. But if he can get there, he could be like a really versatile number 2 catcher where, James McCann will be a free agent after 2024. You let McCann walk and you start 25 with Basallo as your number 2 catcher. And then you only ask him really to catch probably twice a week. But in between there, he can DH, he can play some first base, maybe after you've probably let Ryan Onerun walk after 2024. And you can fit him into the lineup in different ways to get his bat in there. Because that power bat from the left side at Camden Yards is going to be special. So if the O's don't find a trade, and again, if he's a guy that a team wants for an ace, I'm sending him away. The Orioles need a top-line starting pitcher. But if they can't find that deal that fits him in there, there will be space. Despite Adley Rutschman, there will be space for him at the big league level. If I had to guess right now, I actually would say the Orioles deal him for an ace because he's a little further from the big league level. But again, if they can't find it, they will get at-bats for this guy. He's that good. 4 more questions to get to here on a Mailbag Monday episode. We'll get to the next 2 coming up next. A little question about Oriole fan favorite Trey Mancini, and then about Orioles draft picks and what a lineup would look like next year if it was just all homegrown Orioles starting a game in Baltimore. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Jase Medical. Now we got a lot of questions. What is Jase Medical? Jase Medical is really the company that is there for you. Now, we spend a lot of time talking together, and we get fired up for wins and losses, and who starts and who sits, and we have that connection here. And I can tell you about our products that we talk about as well, including Jase Medical. Now, Jase Medical, they've got a lot of things, but they also have their Jase case, which supplies antibiotics, 5 different ones, when you need them. And you can also get any kind of daily medication, including ED medications at Jase Medical. So if you or someone you love would get some peace of mind by having a year's supply of any daily med, go to jasemedical.com to see if it's offered for you. And remember to use promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your purchase. So we're back here on a Mailbag Monday episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. 4 more questions to get to here on the pod. And our next question comes from Andy on Twitter, who says, would Trey Mancini accept any kind of minor league deal next season? And would the Orioles potentially do it to bring him back? Now, the Trey Mancini end to his big league career, it does kind of make me sad, right? Like, a lot of this had to do with him going through the colon cancer and what happened to him in 2020. And it's tough. Now, we know the Orioles brought him back. He was a productive player. They traded him to the Astros at the deadline in 22. He struggles with Houston down the stretch, but does win a World Series ring with the Astros last year, becomes a free agent, and did sign, a 2-year deal with the Chicago Cubs. It did not work out. He had 263 plate appearances with the Cubs in 2023, hit .234 with a .299 on base and a .336 slugging. That was just a 74 WRC plus, had a 30% strikeout rate, and the Cubs basically DFA'd and released him midway through the season. Now, a little bit after that, the Reds did sign him to a minor league deal, and he crushed the ball in 5 AAA games with the Reds. Basically played a week there, and then the Reds released him. Now, the Reds did have a lot of position players, so it was probably tough to get Mancini to the big league level, but he was killing it, and they didn't at least leave him in AAA. They just released him. So I don't know if that was maybe his choice or their choice. But once he was released by the Reds, I believe that was sometime in late August, early September, he didn't sign on with another team for the rest of the season. And that's not to say he won't sign with another team. I think he still could have some juice in that bat. But with the way the last couple of years have gone for Trey Mancini, first of all, if he's open to a minor league deal with the Orioles, I think the O's would give it to him, right? There's not a lot of risk in giving out a minor league deal. You invite the guy to big league camp, you let him compete for a job, right? It's really nothing bad against that. But I just think with how his time with the Orioles ended with the trade, I don't see Mancini coming back to Baltimore on a minor league deal just 2 years after he was kind of like the fan favorite of the franchise. I just don't see him doing that. Now, in terms of getting a minor league deal elsewhere, I unfortunately think that's the only way Mancini is going to be in a big league camp in March of 2024. I think the only way is to be on a minor league deal with an invite to spring training, trying to make a team. And I could certainly see him doing that, right? Finding a team that needs some right-handed hitting, needs right-handed power bat, needs somebody at first base, maybe works on his outfield defense, tries to be a little more versatile and make a ball club. He still has the talent to do so. But I just kind of have this feeling with all he's went through and the struggles the last couple of years. If you made me pick, and I really don't have any inside information on this, just making me pick, I think Mancini might be done. I think that might be kind of it for his baseball career. I could see him being a guy who's content with what he battled through, coming back from cancer, getting back on the field, and being a productive player after that, how beloved he is in Baltimore, won a World Series ring, and it just didn't work out this year in that new contract with the Cubs. I could see him being done. I could totally be wrong. He could totally sign a minor league deal or even a very small major league deal with kind of a rebuilding team and get some major league ABs this year. But I could certainly see it where that might be it for Trey Mancini. Fourth question of the day comes from Matthew via email, who writes in, what is your ideal 2024 all Orioles draft picks starting lineup? Basically, and Matthew went on to explain a little bit more in the email, but basically what he talked about is, in 2024, it's very realistic to put together a full starting lineup, 1 through 9 hitters and a starting pitcher of all players who were drafted and developed by the Orioles. And he said, so what would be the best version of that for next season? I think this is what it looks like. Leading off is your catcher, Adley Rutschman. Batting second is your shortstop, Gunnar Henderson. Batting third is your first baseman, Ryan Mountcastle. Batting fourth is your DH, Heston Kjerstad. Batting fifth at second base is Jackson Holliday. Batting sixth at third base is Jordan Westberg. Batting seventh in center field is Cedric Mullins. Batting eighth in left field is Austin Hayes. And batting ninth in right field is Colton Cowser, with Grayson Rodriguez on the mound getting the start. That's not a lineup I would want to see maybe next year, because I'd like the O's to, have Anthony Santander in there. And, we want to see some Ryan Onerun among other guys. And maybe, they bring in some more hitting talent. But that is certainly a possible lineup for next season. And it's a possible lineup that could win some baseball games for the O's. I mean, that's how good they have drafted and developed over the years. To have those 10 guys all drafted by the O's could be a good Major League Baseball team right now. It truly is very, very impressive. But we got 2 more mailbag questions to get to here on this episode before we finish it out, talking a bit more about lineups, specifically how next year's opening day lineup will compare to the one the Orioles put out there in 2023. And then we'll talk a bit about why the O's had success in 2023, specifically one-run games and hitting in runners in scoring position. They were very good at that last year. Is that repeatable, though, next year? We'll get to that right after this. So we got 2 more questions to get to here on a Mailbag Monday episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Again, thank you all who have sent in your questions. Continue to send them. Email us, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. Tweet us at LockedOnOrioles. Leave them in the YouTube comment section right here. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles podcast on YouTube. 5th question of the day comes from Bill on Twitter, who asks, how many players from the Orioles 2023 opening day lineup will appear in their 2024 opening day lineup? This is a pretty interesting question. I like this one from Bill. He actually sent this in a couple of months ago. Remember, I keep that rolling list of the mailbag questions. I will get to them and get into them now. So here is what the Orioles 2023 opening day lineup looked like. Cedric Mullins, Adley Rutschman, Anthony Santander, Ryan Mountcastle, Gunnar Henderson, Ramon Arias, Austin Hayes, Adam Frazier, Jorge Mateo, with Kyle Gibson on the bump. Those were the 10 players that were in that lineup. I'm going to guess that 6 of those 10 players will be in the Orioles 2024 opening day lineup. I think the locks are Adley Rutschman and Gunnar Henderson. I think those are the 2 absolute stone cold locks. I think most likely Ryan Mountcastle's in there as well, unless it was like a really tough righty and the Orioles wanted to sit him and play Onerun and maybe Kjerstad or something. But I would say most likely to at least start the year, you're seeing Mountcastle out there. Same thing with Cedric Mullins. There could be something that happens this offseason where he would be dealt, or, maybe it's a tough lefty that he doesn't play against. But again, most likely you'll see Mullins. That gets us to 4 of them. Anthony Santander, there is a lot of speculation swirling around him this offseason. I've made it clear multiple times on this podcast, the Orioles should not trade him, that they should bring Santander back next year. And heck, they should even try to maybe extend him for a couple more years after that. But there is the argument, hey, he's going to be due almost $13 million in arbitration this year. He's a free agent after 2024. These are guys that if John Angelos is talking like, hey, we want to be the Guardians, we want to be the Brewers, we want to be the Rays. Santander is a guy that those teams would trade at this point. So it could happen. But if he's not, clearly he's going to be in that lineup. And then the last guy is Austin Hayes. There's kind of multiple ways he could not end up in that lineup, right? If he is dealt this offseason, if he does start the year in some sort of platoon or more of a bench role where he doesn't get the start next year, if he does get injured again, I mean, there's multiple ways he's not in there. But I just think, even if I don't think Austin Hayes is the left fielder by the end of next year, which I actually think is the case, I don't think he'll have that role every day. I think at least to start 2024, Hayes will be in that spot. And we know how good of a first half player he's been the last 2 years. So you probably want him in the lineup before the All-Star break. So that's why I would put Hayes in there. The guys I left out, Ramon Arias, I think there's like a 50-50 shot he's on the opening day roster. But even if he is, good chance he's like your bench versatile infield guy and probably not starting on opening day. Adam Frazier, just don't really see a situation where the Orioles bring him back. He's a free agent. And again, Jorge Mateo, another guy where it's like feels like it's 50-50 if he's even on the opening day roster, depending on what the Orioles do with their other infielders. But again, I guess if he was on the roster and they were facing a left-handed starter, I could see him getting the start there. But otherwise, if he is on the team, I feel like he's probably on the bench. And then again, Kyle Gibson. There's maybe a small chance the Orioles would bring Kyle Gibson back to eat some more innings, but I kind of doubt it at this point, which means the opening day starting pitcher is going to be different, and I think all signs point to Kyle Bradish starting on opening day in 2024. And then our final question of the day comes from Harris on Twitter, who said, 2 things largely contributed to the Orioles' success in 2023. Wins in one-run games, which is true, and their success hitting with runners in scoring position, also true. And Harris asks, how much can those things carry over to next season? This is a really good question because, yes, the Orioles were very good at both of those things in 2023. The Orioles were 30-16 in one-run games, one of the best records in one-run games. Also, remember, they tied for the most comeback wins in all of baseball as well. And then the Orioles had a 287 average and a 128 WRC plus when hitting with runners in scoring position this season. Those were both number 1 in all of Major League Baseball. That kind of goes together with the one-run wins and the comeback wins. When you're in those key spots, usually late in the game, got runners on second, runners on third, wherever they may be, the Orioles drove them home in 2023 in big fashion. But the question is, again, is that sustainable? Is that repeatable for 2024? Let's start with the runners in scoring position stats. Now, on one hand, it's not entirely perfectly repeatable, right? Because yes, you're getting hits in those key spots, but it's a little random, runners in scoring position, right? Like, what is the real difference? If you come up with a runner on first with 1 out or a runner on second with 1 out, what is the true difference in that spot? Especially if it's like the 4th inning, right, of a 3-1 game. Like, what is the true difference in that situation specifically if you're hitting with a runner on first or runner on second, 1 out? The only difference is if you single with the runner on second, you probably get an RBI. If you single with the runner on first, you get a rally going, but you're not getting the RBI, and you're not getting a hit with runners in scoring position. But in terms of game leverage, spot, what your approach is, it's mostly the same in those 2 positions, right? So if you expand that out through the rest of the game, and I get it, like late, runner on second, no outs, 1-run game, 9th inning, like things change when there's runners in scoring position versus not. But in a lot of those situations, it's more so random, those spots, and it's not really, hey, a lot of your approach changes in this spot. So because of that, there is some variance. But also, when you think about it year over year, the teams that are getting hits with runners in scoring position are generally, and this kind of feeds off of the it's kind of random, are generally the team that are getting the most hits overall, right? Like, yes, sometimes there are outlier teams who are just way better with runners in scoring position than they are overall. The Orioles were kind of that this year, but they also just had a good offense overall this season. Sometimes there's outliers, but generally, the teams that are hitting with runners in scoring position are also hitting with runners on first and are also hitting with the bases empty and are the teams scoring a lot of runs no matter how they do it. This kind of shows in, let's take the Houston Astros, for example, right? They've been one of the best offenses in baseball for years now. They were second in hitting with runners in scoring position in 2022. They were third in the league in 2023. So essentially, they stayed right where they were. Dodgers, very, very similar here, right? They've been top 4 in baseball each of the last 2 years. They're also a very, very good offense. So if the Orioles continue to be just a good offense overall, they may not end up first in this category again with runners in scoring position next year, but they should be easily like a top 5, top 7 or 8 team in those statistics because they're just a good offense overall. So if they're going to hit in general, they're going to get hits when there's runners on second or third. That's kind of how I see it. Now, I think the one-run games is a little bit of a different thing. Again, the Orioles were 30-16 in the one-run games this year. That's one of the best records in baseball. Some of that has to do with bullpen coming in clutch, and the Orioles bullpen was not as good this year as it was in 2022, and they're going to be without Felix Bautista in 2024, which is certainly going to be an issue. I think without Felix, your one-run record certainly takes a hit, right? Like that's the number one thing. The weapon he is, especially in those extra inning games to win one-run games, the amount of times he would keep it tied in the 9th on the road, the O's would get one run in the top of the 10th, and he would shut it down in the bottom of the 10th, even with the zombie runner on second. That's going to hurt your one-run record. Also, there's a lot of variance in one-run games. And, managers pulling the right strings, and Brandon Hyde pulled a lot of the right strings in 2023. That's why he could be manager of the year in the American League. But things just have to bounce your way to win a lot of one-run games. Here's a good example. The 2012 Orioles, kind of the kings of the one-run games, second best team ever in one-run games. They were 29-9 that year. Also had the incredible record in extra innings too, but specifically 29-9 in 2012. They win 93 games to get to the ALDS. If you remember, the 2013 Orioles were not that dissimilar from the 2012 Orioles in terms of their roster composition. Really, the only differences were Mark Reynolds and Jim Thome were not there, right? Like, that was about it for the 2013 Orioles that they didn't have. It was like returning most of that offense. And yet, the 2012 Orioles were 29-9 in one-run games. And they also returned most of the same pitching staff and basically that same dominant bullpen. They returned everything. The 2013 Orioles went 20-31 in one-run games, and they had a winning record, but they missed the postseason that next year. It was a very similar roster, and they were completely different. Same manager, too. Completely different in one-run games. There is a lot of variance that goes into that. You cannot count on being that good in one-run games, and when you add in the fact that you are without the best closer in baseball because he got Tommy John, I definitely think one thing to worry about next year would be the Orioles are just not going to win as many of those close games as they did this season, which tells me, hey, let's add to this team, right? Let's get ahead of it this offseason. Let's add a good starting pitcher. Maybe let's add a key bat, and let's get some 3, 4, 5-run leads in more games next year because it's probably less likely for a multitude of reasons that they keep those one-run leads in as many games as they did this year. But that'll do it for today's mailbag episode. Thank you so much for sending in your questions. Again, if I didn't get to your question, coming up on a future mailbag episode. We've got a lot going on the podcast this week, still 5 days a week throughout November. A lot of fun episodes, including tomorrow when we return on the pod. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.